Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry, and this is the book we're going to be talking about today. It is The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ.
Roger Stone, who has been around politics longer than most of the people have been alive in this country today. We're talking a teenager for Barry Goldwater, worked for Richard Nixon, for Ronald Reagan, and he is spending a good part of each year in Miami Beach as a resident. We think you'll enjoy this one. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. So great to be with you and with our listeners across Florida and viewers at Tough TV Network, which is all over the country.
Yeah.
So this is really exciting. We're really happy to have the kind of exposure that we're getting. And we look forward to being on more often. I think you'll enjoy the subject matter we'll be talking about today with Roger Stone.
Yeah.
And, Reagan, I just want to briefly say, we've done a couple shows about the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
And the reason why we've done these shows is because it's important. It's important for the American people to know that things aren't all roses and sunshine. And really, you need to understand that politics is a very dirty business. And it might sound theoretically like people are doing work for the country and public service and all that, but really it's a lot of ego games and people wanting power, and to the point like this Johnson, who theoretically could have been behind the assassination of President Kennedy, a coup d'etat in America.
Well, if you've seen meat packing plants or whatever, and you don't like how sausage gets made, you can't look at it, you ain't gonna like politics.
No.
So
it's a dirty business, and if you think things were bad 50 years ago, I don't know if they've gotten really any better per se. I think they've gotten actually worse. And, it just gives people pause. But if you don't like the way things have been the last 50 years, through Vietnam, through Watergate, through three wars, the economy kind of going into the toilet, well, you could all trace it back, I think, to the Kennedy assassination. Because I think what the Kennedy assassination did was it emboldened these guys, and it made them understand that whatever they could just get away with it, that they could just get away with subverting democracy and republicanism in America. And I say both words because we live in a democracy. It's of the people, by the people, for the people, through representative government. Mm-hmm. So that's the way it's supposed to be anyway, Reagan. I don't know what it is now, but
sure. Well, as in just a couple of moments, we're going to be joined by a gentleman who has been a political consultant. He's a strategist, a lobbyist. This is the man who brought down Eliot Spitzer as governor of New York a couple of seasons back. He's been around a long time. He is now spent a good portion of the year living in Miami Beach. His name is Roger Stone. He's worked for Richard Nixon. He was in favor of Barry Goldwater. He worked for Ronald Reagan.
Worked for George W. Bush.
And he has got a lot to say. So, if you will stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, at this point in the program, we are joined by political analyst, consultant, strategist, lobbyist, Roger Stone, who spends a great deal of his time these days in the Miami Beach area. He's got a brand new book out, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. Yes, you heard that right. But before we get to that, in case you're not familiar with Roger Stone, this is the man who brought down the former New York governor, Eliot Spitzer, here a couple of seasons back. Crucial role in a recount that made George W. Bush the president, involved in politics since he was a teenager. He worked for Richard Nixon, for the Reagan administration. He's played key roles in the election of candidates in three parties, Republican, Democrat, and Libertarians. You have seen him on Fox, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, golly, just all kinds of things. And we are proud to have you as a resident of Miami Beach. And Roger Stone, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
It's great to be with you. I'm kind of like the Forrest Gump of American politics. I'm like the bad penny. I just keep turning up.
And we're never quite sure what we're going to get. Is that the no?
Now, what got you interested in getting into the political game?
I was a Goldwater zealot in my preteen days. One of my next door neighbors was an active Republican lady. Gave me a book by Barry Goldwater entitled "Conscience of a Conservative." Up until that time in my young life, I wanted to be an actor. Then I figured out politics was really just show business for ugly people.
That's a line I've used in the past as well.
That's why Al and I do radio.
So you were the youngest member of CREEP, the committee to reelect the president for Nixon in '72.
Yes. You know, I owe my political career to Richard Nixon. He was both very great and very flawed, like all human beings, I guess. He did some very great things. He did some incredibly stupid things. My book's not in any way an apology or rehabilitation of him. It's kind of a warts and all book about the times, the early 1960s, the intrinsic evil of Lyndon Johnson, the corruption of Lyndon Johnson, the desperation of Lyndon Johnson, and then the dealings of the Kennedys, which I think caused many of their own problems and ultimately led to the assassination of both John and Robert Kennedy. Make no excuses for Nixon. He's got some, there's some warts in there about him too. So it's a good read. But if you want to know how American politics really works and how intense the competition to be president in the early 1960s was, this book kind of tells it out.
Yeah. Let me say up front that I am absolutely no fan of Lyndon Johnson, a president who overreached. It was all too much. I was never particularly a fan of the Kennedys. Mrs. Kennedy invented this Camelot stuff. I never bought into that. And Richard Nixon fell off the pedestal. I mean, holy cow, what in the world was he afraid of in 1972? He carries 49 states, and he's got to know their plans. They all have, as you say, warts. But where I'm going with this, the conspiracy books are out there by the dozens. What made you decide that this particular book, in amongst all this other stuff that's out there floating around, especially this 50th anniversary year, what made you decide that it was time that this book was necessary?
Well, because there was a missing piece. In other words, there's a lot of good scholarship on the CIA's involvement in Kennedy's assassination, and I think most of it is correct. There's a lot of scholarship about organized crime's role in Kennedy's assassination. There's also a lot written about the role of Big Texas Oil. But I don't think anyone has ever brought it all together and produced the linchpin. Lyndon Johnson is the linchpin of a plot kill John Kennedy. Why? Because he controls Dallas. It's kind of just like real estate. Location is everything. If you control the Dallas police and the Dallas County Sheriff's Office and the Dallas County District Attorney, you control the investigation. Because in 1963, murder in Texas is a state crime, not a federal crime. There's no federal statute against the murder of a president until the late 1970s. Consequently, Johnson controls the investigation from the get-go. Which is why he insisted Kennedy go to Dallas, which is why he and his protege, John Connally, micromanaged the president's schedule in Dallas. The day before, the 21st, he was in Houston and San Antonio. Johnson could care less, just didn't care, whereas he micromanaged every minute of Kennedy's time on the ground in Dallas.
Well, it obviously leads to a conclusion raised by your book that LBJ wanted to be president so badly that he would stage a coup d'etat in America. I guess that's more than, between 60 and 80% of the American people, depending on the poll you read, now believe that there was a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy. But whenever you talk to or watch the media, there was a big media barrage a few weeks ago, as you know, about the 50th anniversary of the assassination. I was watching a piece by Bob Schieffer, who is a respected journalist, and he said he's seen but
not by me. Go ahead.
No, and not by me either. After watching this tripe, because he's saying that he's seen all these books about conspiracies, and he doesn't see anything that's proof. But I mean, the proof is there if you just look at it. I guess if you,
no question. There's no question. There's a book written by a guy named Barr McClellan who went before me. He laid out the early case against Johnson in some public setting. Someone attempted to ask Schieffer about that book, and his response was, "Oh, that book's been discredited." Wrong. It's the Warren Commission that's been discredited. I don't rely on a magic bullet. He does. A magic bullet that changes directions. So at this late juncture, in all honesty, I don't see how anyone with any level of objectivity or intelligence can believe the Warren Commission. It's riddled with holes now. It's like Swiss cheese. You can take any number of examples. How about the paraffin test done on Oswald shows he hadn't fired a rifle that day. No nitrogen on his face or his hands or his arms, which, given that $14 Italian carbine, there would have been.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are lots of pieces, but let's look at the big picture on it. What makes you, obviously, for those who don't know LBJ, the personality of the man, the demeanor of the man. Of course, Reagan brought up a book that was written in the mid-'60s, A Texan Looks at Lyndon. So this line about Lyndon Johnson being a monster of a man is nothing really new. But tell us why he'd be the most logical mastermind behind an assassination.
Sure. It's not just ambition. It's that in 1963, he knows that Bobby Kennedy wants to put him in prison. He's got two active federal investigations into his corruption. The Bobby Baker investigation, which is raging in the U.S. Senate. Baker is the Secretary of the U.S. Senate and is Johnson's bag man. The man described by Johnson as, quote, a strong right arm. And he also has the Billy Saul Estes investigation being run by the Justice Department. Robert Kennedy is leaking both of those investigations to Time Life Corporation. Life magazine has 9 full-time investigative reporters on the ground in Texas digging into Johnson's finances for a December 1st cover expose issue. Johnson is cooked meat December 1st. He's going to be indicted and sent to prison, and he knows it. And Robert Kennedy's been telling people in Washington, Johnson's through, he's being dumped from the ticket, and he's going to jail. So it's not just ambition to be president. He had two choices: become president himself or face federal indictment and likely prison, not to mention the public humiliation of that. So it gives him a unique motive. So I tried to approach this like a murder investigation. Motive, means, opportunity. Johnson has all three.
Let me ask you this, and then just real quick. Did Kennedy ever think that LBJ would want to have him bumped off? I mean, he knew the man, he knew the man's ego, and he knew the man's determination to be president. Did that ever cross his mind? Do you think?
I don't think he took Johnson's track record as a serial murderer in Texas seriously. In fact, in 1960, he is essentially blackmailed into taking Johnson on the ticket. He has already chosen Stuart Symington, the senator from Missouri. He's offered Symington the job. Symington is accepted. He's writing his acceptance speech. Lyndon Johnson shows up at Kennedy's hotel room late at night, and he's got a file with him, a file from J. Edgar Hoover, a file on Jack Kennedy's sex life. And he basically says, you need me, you need Texas, and if you don't put me on the ticket, I'll give this file to Dick Nixon. You can talk about it this October in the election. And, of course, you know, the mores were very different in 1960. Our first Catholic president, a family man. If word had gotten out in 1960 that he was a philanderer, he probably would have been elected. He already had a playboy reputation. So he folded. They asked him why he took Johnson on the ticket, and he said, oh, don't worry about me. I'm in perfect health. He'll never be president. Well, I think he was wrong about that.
That absolutely true. In the many years in your associations in and out of the White House, and lots of names, as you put this material together, how important were some of those names that came along later? Names like John Mitchell.
Yep. You know, one of the reasons I waited so long to write this book is that a lot of my corroborating information regarding Nixon and Nixon's maneuvers and what Nixon knew and what Nixon thought, and in all honesty, how the JFK assassination relates to both the Bay of Pigs and later on to Watergate, because this is one thread. I'm convinced at the end of the day that the reason that Ford gave Nixon a pardon, for example, was because had Nixon gone to trial, he was going to blow the whistle on everybody. The CIA's involvement in the Kennedy assassination, as well as Jerry Ford's personal involvement in doctoring the autopsy records for the Warren Commission. He was going to take everybody down with him if he was going. And it really explains not only why Ford pardoned Nixon to his own detriment, it probably cost him re-election, and I think it also explains the 18-and-a-half-minute gap in the Watergate tapes. I think that's a discussion of, if you're coming after me, then I'm going to lay out the Kennedy assassination and how that was covered up.
You know, these are very interesting points, and I remember reading in your book when you talk with Mitchell that he said to wait 50 years before publishing it.
Well, he said wait till the 50th anniversary because he wanted to be sure that he and virtually all the other contemporaries had passed away, which indeed they had. Mitchell didn't learn, for example, until 1971 that the man who approved the mob CIA assassination plots against Castro was none other than Vice President Richard Nixon. That's a secret that Nixon spent 30 years trying to hide. Had that ever come out publicly, he would not have been able to make the comeback that he made in 1968. So Mitchell was an invaluable confirmer of a lot of the things that Nixon said. Nixon often spoke in code. He was he wasn't good at small talk. He was not introspective or retrospective. He was very kind of liked to be alone with his own thoughts, and therefore sometimes the things that he said needed interpretations. Haldeman wrote in his biography, Nixon's chief of staff, that when Nixon referred to the whole Bay of Pigs thing, he meant that included the Kennedy assassination, which he thought was a blowback from what had happened in Cuba.
Well, it's an interesting point.
And I'll tell you what, Al, hold on to that point, and we'll talk more about Mr. Nixon's paranoia and some of those other thoughts. But we want to take a pause along the network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll continue our conversation following these messages. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is political analyst, consultant, lobbyist Roger Stone, who resides a good portion of the year in Miami Beach. His brand new book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. And Al, just as we went into that last break, you had a point that you wanted to make with Roger.
Well, first off, I wanted to let some folks know that if you're interested in getting a book signed and meeting Roger Stone, you can meet him on December 6th at 7 p.m. In Buffalo, New York at Talking Leaves Books. Of course, we probably don't have too many listeners. Of course, we have online listeners. So, but in Florida, December 9th at 8 p.m., Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. That should be a short trip from you, I'm sure, because you live down there, right, Roger? So.
Yep, should be a good event.
Yeah.
I want to get to the point, and the main point of this. We had Jesse Ventura on about his new book regarding the Kennedy assassination. And he makes, of course, the same points that you are making. There even is a part about LBJ being behind, a short part of it, but about the other details relating to the assassination. I think we all have to realize what this has meant for America since 50 years ago and how the country's changed. And my opinion, and I think Reagan's is too, is that once these dark people, these people who have evil intent, saw that they could win and actually kill a president, well, then there's nothing to stop them. And now that there's nothing to stop them, they've been able to wreak havoc upon our economy, our the social life of America, the system itself. And I heard, and I don't know how, this is apocryphal, of course, but I heard that when a new president takes office, they have a secret meeting with him, and they show him the Kennedy assassination footage of the Zapruder film, and they say, okay, you're going to either play ball or not. And I don't know how true that is, but to me it sounds pretty plausible.
Yeah, no, it's I forget whose comedy routine is, but basically they call the new president in, they pull down a screen, they show him a film of the Kennedy assassination from an angle you've never seen it before, appears to be shot from the grassy knoll. Then they end the film and they say, any questions?
Yeah.
I think that's certainly, it's probably apocryphal, but it may be partially true. What's interesting to me, of course, is that with the advent of new technology, internet, cell phones, and so on, it's much tougher for the government to perpetrate a cover-up. If this had happened in 2013 instead of 2016, instead of just the Zapruder film, which in my view was altered and played with, you'd have had 100 cell phone cameras immediately shooting the event. You'd have video, you'd have still photos. You would really have a good handle on on what had happened. It'd be much tougher for the American government to stage a cover up like this.
I want to throw a couple of names at you because in all of this, names that don't necessarily come up very often, and perhaps some of our listeners may not even know that these people had any connection to the investigation, the Warren Commission, things like that. Let's start with Arlen Specter, the late Arlen Specter.
Yeah, a very, very good friend of mine, ironically. I worked in 3 of his Senate races, and we fought like a cat and dog over cocktails. He never gave an inch on this. People need to understand that Arlen Specter was a very, very smart, very tough, very abrasive, very ambitious guy. And he's merely doing what Earl Warren and Alan Dulles on the Warren Commission tell him to do, which is to button this up. Now, as I have moved around and talked about my book, people say to me, now, come on, you're accusing all these learned, respected men of treason. You're accusing them of a cover-up. Why would senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices do this? And it's very simple, because Johnson lies to every one of them. He says the Russians did this. We know the Russians did it. If the American people learn that, there'll be a demand for retribution. We're talking about a nuclear holocaust, and millions will die. So, Judge Warren, you've got to help me cover this up. You're doing it for your country. I really think that's the cover story. And you even begin to see that leaking out last week, 2 weeks ago, where John Kerry, our current Secretary of State, IQ 70, says he doesn't believe Oswald did it. He doesn't believe Oswald acted alone. He's part right. And he says, I think the Russians and the Cubans did it. Let's be clear. There is not one iota of evidence, none whatsoever, that the Russians did this. Posner, Bugliosi, none. Sorry, guys, none. You got nothing. Robert Kennedy sends a message to the Russians right after the assassination. What does he say? It was a domestic conspiracy that killed my brother. So you already see this disinformation beginning to be planted, because I think over time more and more Americans just don't buy the Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So now the establishment's new situation is, okay, maybe he didn't act alone, but he was a communist. He was acting for the Russians. The Russians did it. That's false.
And the Smithsonian in recent years, and I'm going back more than a couple of years here, have started to release a great deal of the tape recordings that were made of Lyndon Johnson on the telephone. They used to say he had a phone growing out of his ear. He used the telephone like no president ever had before him. And one of the earliest pieces that came out is Lyndon Johnson pressuring Georgia Senator Richard Russell.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. On the day that the Warren Commission report is signed, Russell says, these are quotes, "I don't believe a word of it." And Johnson responds, "I don't either." Really, that's not what we told the Warren Commission. We also know that on New Year's Eve, 1964, when he shacked up at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, with his longtime mistress, Madeline Duncan Brown, she asks him point blank, people are saying you were in on the assassination. He says, it wasn't me, it was the CIA and those oil bastards. direct quote. Well, he is the CIA. He's the appropriator for the CIA. The CIA budget from 1951 to 1961 triples under Lyndon Johnson's tutelage. He sits on the subcommittee where they bury the secret black box budgets. He's gotten them all their cash, and as strong as the CIA is, they can't operate without money. He's the chief appropriator for the military-industrial complex. He's tighter with the CIA. He's a member of the House committee that oversees the formation of the CIA in 1947 to 49. So it is absurd that he leaves himself out of that conspiracy. But again, the CIA and the oil guys, that's not what he told the Warren Commission.
Well, one of the interesting things is he kept that line about conspiracy, foreign conspiracy, going even in his last interview with Walter Cronkite right before he died. I think you saw that where he said, "Oh, I think there was a conspiracy, but it was external."
Because it covers his posterior. I mean, it is a lie that he tells over and over again, and he uses it to get otherwise good men, some good men at least, to act against their own interests. Look, Hoover goes to Gerald Ford, who's a congressman, who's a member of the Warren Commission. He says, we have a problem. This single bullet thing's not working out because it contradicts the autopsy. And Ford changes the autopsy in his own hand to reflect, to change the description of a bullet that hit JFK in the upper back to hitting him in the lower neck, thus accommodating the wound on the front of his throat, thus accommodating the cockamamie single bullet theory.
Well, but the interesting thing about it is, here's Bobby Kennedy, and he's playing along with it all. He hides the autopsy photos. He doesn't have them released to the Warren Commission. I know he obviously didn't intentionally want to have anything to do with the cover-up, but then he is part of the cover-up.
Well, because as he tells Walter Sheridan, his top aide, I know what happened, but there's nothing I can do about it now. What's he going to do? Go to Hoover? Go to the CIA? Go to the Justice Department? He's still Attorney General in name only. Johnson begins acting with his deputy, Nicholas de Katzenbach, who is the de facto Attorney General. So who's the cop that Bobby's going to? Hoover? There's no place to go. They have him boxed. He understands politics. Mm-hmm. The only way he can break this open is by becoming president himself. That's why 4 days before he's assassinated, he says in Northern California, if elected, he will reopen the investigation into his brother's death. I think that's a contributing factor in his murder, but I also think it had to send chills down the spines of those who did plot JFK's death. Johnson and the boys at the CIA and the mob boys, they have got to be concerned about that.
What did Gerald Ford have to get out of this?
I think that Johnson had photographs or films of Gerald Ford with a prostitute taken at the Sheraton Carlton Hotel in Suite 561, which was used by a lobbyist named Fred Black, where he would often entertain congressmen and senators and get them into compromising situations. I think Hoover had the goods on. I think Johnson had the goods on Ford. On the other hand, Ford was very much a supporter of the FBI and the funding for Hoover, so I'm not sure they needed to blackmail him. I think he would have done what they wanted anyway. In 1995, when Ford is asked by the New York Times why he altered the autopsy records, he says, quote, the country needed clarity. You notice he doesn't say the country needed truth. In other words, he just wanted to put it to bed. In the memoirs of two of the top FBI guys, Deke DeLoach and William Sullivan, they both detail how Hoover sends instructions to Ford that he's got to solve the autopsy problem in order to get the Warren Commission members to go along with the 3 bullets from behind single bullet theory.
Wow. Roger, on that note, we need to pause again along our network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is political analyst, consultant Roger Stone. His new book, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. And if you'll stay put, we'll continue our conversation following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Sprine. It's great to be on the Tough TV network across the country with this special edition of Florida Roundtable.
Absolutely. Our very special guest this day is nationally known political consultant Roger Stone, who lives a good portion of the year in Miami Beach now, and we're proud to have him here in Florida. He's got a brand new book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. Should be available at most of the fine bookstores around Florida. If not, they will order it for you. It is from our friends at Skyhorse Publishing, and it is well worth the read. And Roger, thank you so much for spending all this time with us today. We know how busy you are.
Terrific to be with you.
Let's talk about your conversations with Nixon regarding the Kennedy assassination and his thoughts, because, as you said, this all ties from the Bay of Pigs, the formation of the secret CIA hit squads and programs, through the Kennedy assassination, through the Vietnam War, through in background, of course, then into the assassination of Martin Luther King, many say, and RFK, Robert Kennedy, and into Watergate. And then, so it basically, I'm sure that the man who knew a lot about it was Nixon. What did he have to say to you?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that in 1963, Richard Nixon was completely and totally washed up. He was considered a complete has-been. He was only 1 year off of blowing the race for governor of California and then melting down in public afterwards in a press conference in which he angrily said he was done with politics. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference. Only 6 years later, he was being sworn in as President of the United States, which has to go down as one of the greatest comebacks in American politics. In this particular case, ironically, Nixon is actually in Dallas the day of the assassination. He flies to Dallas on the 20th of November. He leaves the morning of the 22nd, essentially leaving Dallas at about the same time that JFK is arriving. He's there for a Pepsi-Cola Bottlers convention. He has a press conference on Saturday, which gets pretty good attendance. You can go on YouTube and even see the television clips where he predicts that Johnson will be dumped from the ticket. That's the lead of his press conference. And he also issues a criticism of Kennedy's foreign policy. But Nixon he's without any kind of governmental power in 1963. I mean, he is really considered done. He leaves Dallas, flies back to New York. When he gets to New York, he hears on the taxi cab radio, that Kennedy's been shot. When he gets to his apartment house, the doorman tells him, "Oh, Mr. Vice President, President Kennedy's dead." He goes upstairs, he picks up the phone, he calls J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, and he says, "Edgar, was it one of those right-wing nuts?" You can see Nixon's mind working. He's worried that he's going to be blamed because of his Saturday press conference. Although he was very careful to urge the people of Dallas to give the President of the United States a courteous welcome. So he kind of covered his tail. And Nixon is told by Hoover, "No, Dick, it's a communist. It was a communist." It's only been 37 minutes since Oswald has been apprehended, but Hoover already knows all about him. That's interesting. And Nixon believes that for about 48 hours. And then he's watching television with millions of other Americans, and he sees Jack Ruby blow away Oswald. And according to Nick Ruey, the aide who was with him, he jumps to his feet, he turns white as a ghost, he points to the screen, he says, "I know that guy." 1985, Nixon tells me, the hell of it is, he said, "I knew this Jack Ruby guy. Went by the name Rubenstein. He was an informant. He was one of Lyndon Johnson's boys." Murray Schotner, who's a guy who worked for Nixon, brought him to me in 47, told me Lyndon wanted us to put him on the payroll part-time, and we did. And then, of course, I found the payroll records that demonstrate that Jack Ruby did indeed work for the House Un-American Activities Committee as a part-time informant for Congressman Richard Nixon. So I think at that point, Nixon understood immediately Johnson's role in the assassination, as well as Johnson's, and of course he fully understood the CIA's role and how the Bay of Pigs had morphed into the assault on Kennedy. So I think he knew, and I think that it was the secret that got him a pardon at the end of his career. It was the dirty secret that would have brought everybody down.
Well, that great line you said, he said that Lyndon and I both wanted to be president more than anything, but I wouldn't kill for it.
Yeah, that was what he said. The same dinner, 1985, at Saddle River, New Jersey. He was not an easy guy to get to give these kind of small talk analysis. He was very interested in the future and the current time. He was not very retrospective. But I asked him point blank, and he said, "That's the thing about Lyndon and I. We both wanted to be president, but I wasn't willing to kill for it."
Wow. Before we run out of time, I want to ask you, Roger, because we've heard from other folks that have done a great deal of work in this field, that in some instances, as they travel around the country, they are having a hard time with the electronic media in getting their story out. And I wonder, what kind of a reception have you been given from not only the electronic media, but the print media as well?
I can't really complain. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Huffington Post have chosen to just completely ignore my book. I was booked on CNN, both for Aaron Burnett and for Crossfire. In fact, they even paid for my airline tickets to Washington, and then under pressure from the LBJ Library, which is subsidized by you and I, the taxpayers, they canceled. That's cowardice. Actually, that's Soviet-style censorship is what it is. The chairman emeritus of CNN, Tom Johnson, is on the library board. He should be ashamed of himself. He's a thug. He fears the truth. In other words, you don't have to believe my book. You may reject my book, but at least read it and make a judgment. To say, "Oh, don't read that book," that's how it worked in Nazi Germany. They were burning books.
Well, that's a villain.
I really think it's unhealthy.
Who's the heroes, though, in the media? Who's had you on, besides us, of course?
Fox has been great. Larry King was great. I was on with Glenn Beck. Was on CBS's Inside Edition. And, of course, we live in an Internet world as well. Radio programs like this reach millions of people. So, the so-called mainstream media, the big boys, the New York Times and the Washington Post, they can't have a media blackout because there's radio shows just like this one. And ultimately, hundreds of thousands of people are going to listen to talk radio. Thank God for talk radio. I was doing 10 shows a day, starting in the morning, worked till 11 o'clock at night. Anybody who would take me and was willing to give me a fair hearing.
What about MSNBC? Did they have you on at all?
Not a word.
So Fox is the only 24-hour news network that had the guts to have you on then.
That CNBC
and CNBC as well. Okay,
CNBC, they were good. Larry Kudlow was terrific. But again, I think the only reason I got decent coverage is because having been in American politics for 40 years, I have a lot of personal relationships. And as I said earlier, I just kind of cashed in my chips. I went to everybody. I went to, for example, Larry Kudlow and Sean Hannity and others, and they were willing to listen. That doesn't mean they endorse my views, but they at least believe in the free exchange of ideas.
At least you got
at CNN, evidently they don't.
Yeah, you got it. You got an open forum, and Roger Stone, please rest assured that the microphones at the door of the studio here at the Florida Roundtable is always open for a gentleman of your caliber. We would love to have you come back and do this again. Well,
it's interesting. Yesterday, I challenged Gerald Posner to a debate, and I think he accepted. Looks what his Twitter feed responds to me. He says, "We'll do it early next year." So I say bring it on.
There's one to watch for, absolutely. All right. Well, the book is The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, by Roger Stone, who lives much of the year in Miami Beach. And again, Roger, our thanks for this eye-opening conversation, and we recommend that folks do pick this up and give it a good read. It's, as Al says, it's a very quick read and a good one. Roger Stone. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a brief closing thought following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And wow, what an eye-opener. Roger Stone, one of the premier political analysts in the United States today, been around a long time, and he is absolutely convinced that LBJ was the man.
Well, I'm convinced as well, and it's really hard to convince some people, though, because they just have an idea in their heads, and there's nothing that's going to shake them of this idea. And that's fine. But I think there are some open-minded Americans out there. And once you realize the truth, and you search for the truth, and you get the truth, no matter how dirty the truth is, it makes us a stronger country. It's better to have the truth in your hand than to keep your head in the sand.
Well, 50 years of having that one theory pounded into your brain and the growth of the Camelot mystique, it can be pretty overwhelming. And so it really is interesting. Again, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ by Roger Stone. We hope that you enjoy the conversation today. We found it to be very stimulating.
Get the book and read the book.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll see you again in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.